Good afternoon. This is the afternoon session, of course, and I have a small announce. Claudio Rodriguez, yes, correct. Claudio Rodriguez is not here. He's not here. So the last talk has been the one of Marcella. Okay. I remember you that at 21 p.m. we have a concert here organized by the Conservatorio di Musica Puccini. It's a local conservatorio, and at 9 o'clock. And the second announcement, we are searching for solution of a field trip tomorrow because the sea conditions are not good. So we hope, but today the boats are on the port, have not made a service. So if tomorrow morning the sea conditions are too worse, we have a plan B, means that have another solution by train. So instead to navigate around, we arrive in Manarola directly by train. So we have to change. It not depends by us, but by the weather. Okay. In Manarola, the National Park of Cinque Terre staff is waiting for us and will be introduced in some projects about the Cinque Terre National Park and other news and other information. Now it's time for the afternoon session, and I invite Fahad Al-Mutairi about you read the code view of language, challenges and promises. You have 30 minutes or 25 plus 5 of discussion.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I have to warn you, I'm working with two computers at the same time and with two glasses. So if I raise my head, I really don't see anybody. So I just see what's in front of me. I will start, of course, the original title of my talk was the Code View of Language, Challenges and Promises. And so in addition to an apology, I also owe you an explanation as to why the title is actually different. I first learned of the publication of Professor Barbieri's recent book during the process of writing this abstract for this conference. And after submission, I managed to get a copy and read it. Of course, I did not at first expect a lot of change in his views on the nature of language, but my expectation is apparently probably wrong. In fact, if we try to track the change, as I said earlier, in Barbieri's views on the nature of language, I think we can identify three stages. And the first stage, language is taken to be based on biological codes. In the second stage, language is a cultural code. And in the last stage, the code view of language seems to me, at least, to disappear altogether. The code view of language, not the code view in general. Now, it seems to me that there was then no point really to talk about the code of view of language when in fact such a view does not exist, or does it? So, of course, there are many points worth of discussion in Professor Barbieri's recent book titled Code and Evolution, The Origins of Absolute Novelties. It's a wonderful book, actually, to read. One point in particular, which I would have, of course, wished to discuss with Professor Barbieri and with you here today, has to do with the relationship between semantics and the syntax. But given, of course, the time constraint, I shall limit my talk to one page only, page number 212. Now, more specifically, I would like to discuss what Professor Barbieri has to say under the subsection whose title is the mechanism of language development. Now, the reason for this selection is actually far from arbitrary. I find this subsection personally, I find it surprising, and I confess a little bit very concerning for me personally, and I explain why. Now, to the next slide. As you can see, I have highlighted the relevant point of discussion here. What Professor Barbieri is basically saying here is that language is based neither on coding nor on interpretation. Now, as you all know, language has long been viewed as a code connecting sounds and meanings. In fact, human languages, as Steels and Zatmari put it, are the archetypal examples of a code. And their definition of a code, and this is really interesting, their definition of a code is precisely the one suggested by Barbieri himself. A small set of arbitrary rules selected from a potentially unlimited number in order to ensure a specific correspondence between two independent words. But then, how does exactly Professor Barbieri view the relationship between language and code? We go to the next slide. Now here is the continuation of this passage. The relevant point here is when he writes, "It is true that there are codes in language, but all linguistics codes are the result of language, not the cause of it." Now, what Professor Barbieri says here has, I think, an ontological implication. If linguistic codes are indeed the result of language, not the cause of it, it follows, I think, that the existence of language is possible without any code. But here is the trouble. How can any meaning be expressed without a certain form? Words, gestures, whatever. How can any function be materialized without some sort of a structure? In short, how can language be possible without a code? More importantly, I think, if language is based neither on coding nor interpretation, as Professor Barbieri believes, then what mechanism is it based on? Now, to the next slide. Here comes the surprising, I think, way out that Professor Barbieri offers. The mechanism that is at work here in the development of language is that is neither coding nor interpretation. It is a totally new mechanism that has been referred to as languaging. Now, I confess that here I felt somewhat alarmed coming from the field of linguistics, because I asked myself, what is languaging? Because I was pleased actually to know that none of my colleagues or co-workers knew what language it is either. So unfortunately, apart from the index, this obscure term is mentioned only on this page of Professor Barbieri's book, and without a clarification of what language it actually means. So in coming to terms with the a sense of a human language, we seem to be abandoning a clear concept of code and embracing instead an obscure notion of languaging. But what is languaging anyway? So we come to the next slide. Of course, I will not go into the details of concerning the history of this concept, but I will only mention some facts. After, of course, digging in trying to find the history of this term. First of all, languaging, not language, languaging, is a notion that is employed by a mainly minority, actually, group of scholars within cognitive science, not outside cognitive. I mean, outside cognitive science could be employed in other fields, but within cognitive science is actually a minority group. You can just check how many articles were published with the title languaging. Now, second of all, there appears to be no agreement actually on what languaging actually consists of. So for example, if you see here with the quotation I provide, Cowley, for example, for him languaging is an activity involving how bodies, living bodies, coordinate with the world. Swain, on the other hand, refers specifically to meaning in her definition. She defines languaging as a dynamic, never-ending process of using language to make meaning. And Love takes languaging to be just a cover term for activities involving language, speaking, hearing, listening, and so on. Now, leaving the first definition aside, which I think too wide to be meaningful and too vague to be of any help here, each of the other two definitions implies that language itself is an integral part of the activity of languaging. What I mean by this is that there can be no talk of languaging without reference to language. And therefore, it cannot be correct to assert that the origin of language is languaging. Nor is it correct, I think, to assert that languaging is the mechanism on which language is based. Now, why are these scholars eschewing the noun language and embracing instead the verb to language? Well, I think because they believe that language, as an abstract system, is merely an epiphenomenon, and that the right object of a study should be the abstract system itself, or sorry, the activity from which the abstract system arises. So not the abstract system itself, but the activity from which the abstract system arises, which is language in this case. But if this activity amounts to nothing other than the abstract system, or putting the abstract system into work, then the question remains as to what the origin of this abstract system in the first place. I mean, a whole field of research is based on the relationship between brain and language, namely neurolinguistics. And if we can talk about neural codes and linguistic codes, then I think it would be unwise to separate the two kinds of code by an activity which is vaguely called languaging. Now, let us just remind ourselves of what Professor Barbieri says earlier on. He suggests that language is based neither on the mechanism of coding nor on the mechanism of interpretation. Well, I must here disagree respectfully. I think language is essentially an inferential code that is actually based on both coding and interpretation. Rarely, I think, if ever, a sentence, for example, delivers its coded meaning without the help of some background information within a certain context. In other words, the content of the message is often bigger than the content of the purely linguistic code. Or to put it actually in terms of code biology, the meaning of a sentence depends on both the fixed rules of a code and the extrapolation of limited data provided by abduction. Now, in fact, the pertinence of code biology to mainstream cognitive linguistics is most obvious, I think, when the code view of language is maintained. And that's why I urge, like, code biologists to maintain the code view of language as it was prior to the concept of languaging being introduced into code biology. This can be illustrated by the grammatical code as viewed by Thomas Gibbon. Now I'll show you just an example from Gibbon's work, and hopefully that will help. Now, Gibbon starts by providing two important quotations, small quotation from Charles Peirce. Now, in the first, Peirce writes, in the syntax of every language, there are logical icons of the kind that are aided by conventional rules. And the second quotation is basically similar. Now, what Gibbon takes Peirce to be saying here is this: the iconicity of syntax is not absolute. So syntax actually is iconic in the first place, but it's not absolute. Its iconicity is not absolute, but rather tempered. The reference to conventional rules is indeed meant to draw our attention to the interaction between more iconic and more symbolic, that is more arbitrary, principles of syntactic encoding. Now, Gibbon next gives a list of some of the main iconic principles found in syntax, including the principle of quantity, the principle of proximity, and the principle of pragmatic order. I will just give an example, a quick example of definition of these principles. As you can see here, the quantity principle is basically saying a larger chunk of information will be given a larger coding material. So here is an example. For example, you can derive activation from activate. Activate, you can derive it from active, and active, you can derive it from act. So if you go from derivation backward, it's less information. If you go forward, you have more information, so more coding material. And this is basically an old idea that Gibbon actually referred to Aristotle in this context, being thought, being as the language being the mirror of thought. Now, the proximity principle, it says like functional operators will be placed closest. So that's also mirroring what you want to say, what information you want to deliver. So one operator here, if we see only, it's always placed next to what you want to constrain or modify. So we say only John met Mary, not somebody else that met Mary. John only met Mary, didn't do something else. John met only Mary, and not somebody else. So it depends on exactly where, so you put it next to it. So the information, the cognitive information is aligned or encoded accordingly. Now, the last one, the principle of pragmatic order, is just the basic topicalization. The topic, you put it in the most important, most urgent, you just comes first, just like in passive construction. So here, as we see, the apple is a topic. The apple was eaten by the boy is subject. So it's just moved to the first as it is more important information. That's another example of iconic principle of pragmatic order. Now, what's the point of this? The point is, as an example now of the mix of these iconic principles with more symbolic principle, arbitrary principles in syntax, Gibbon provides this scale of transitivization, which is at the top of the scale. If you look at, for example, at the top of the scale, the agent, which is, of course, in this example, is the woman, occupies the most topical position. And then at the bottom, it is least topical position, which is obvious now. Of course, we can say the opposite for the patient in this case. Giovanni, in fact, doesn't mention this, but that's understood. In this case, the patient is, of course, the deer, so where it is least topical is actually at the top, the opposite, and most topical at the bottom. Now, we see here two iconic principles at work in this example. The principle of pragmatic order, we see it realized actually in B, C, and D, where it's becoming more important. The patient, the deer, is becoming more and more, gradually occupying a most topical position. There is also a quantity, actually, principle realized in D, where actually the original agent, the subject, original, just deleted altogether. Now, so less encoded material. Now, as the conventional symbolism, where it is exactly here in this example, it is realized by a case marking a scale. We have a scale of marking, case marking. For example, the patient, for the example, the deer, is coded as direct object in A. If we can see, for example, in the direct object, the woman shot the deer direct object. But if we see in B, for example, we see as to the deer the woman shot. So here is topic and object, double coded in this example. And finally, of course, in addition, we have it's coded as a subject in D, it becoming more topical. Now, what this example illustrates, I think, and also what it illustrates by Giovanni himself, is the interplay in syntactic structure between non-arbitrary iconic principle and a norm-dependent conventional principles, symbolic arbitrary symbolism. So given this, what Giovanni asserts here, it is obvious for him now that this combination of more iconic and more arbitrary elements with a single complex code predates for him the human language. And actually he gave a lot of example for this mix of symbolic and iconic principle within biology. For instance, he regards the genetic code itself as an example of this mix of iconic and symbolic abstract principles. He doesn't, for example, believe in the linear structure of DNA. He believes that there is a structure hidden somewhere. It's just apparently linear. Anyway, whatever his views or biological claims, are, whether they are correct or not, I think his work is a clear example illustrating the fact that cognitive linguistics, being predominantly actually functional in character, adopting the code view of language, has much, I think, in common with the code view of language. And with this, I conclude. So we give time for questions. The conclusion are just three, and I finish with these. Language, or languaging, the activity, languaging, is, I think, a vague term and cannot be the basis for human language. And two, I think a human language is based on the mechanism of coding and interpretation. It is an inferential code. And finally, the code view language is better suited, I think, for the cooperation between code biology and cognitive linguistics. And that's exactly what I wanted originally to do today, but after having read Barbieri's book, I had to take a step back and defend the code view of language as it was prior to the publication of this book, and hopefully the future work would be just to continue what I was trying to do today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fahad. We have 10 minutes for discussion.
Just to try to clarify languaging, which is difficult term to define. I would suggest that it is possible to consider languaging compatible with codes, and so a language as a code or a set of codes and languaging, if we consider that languaging it's not totally new to the history of linguistics, because Saussure's parole actually might be translated in terms of languaging, but then if we translate in this way, we can find a link that makes languaging and language compatible. Then, of course, during development, that's still the question, does parole come before lang? This is a good question in a way.
Thank you. Shall I answer him? Yeah, it's just, I think he's right. I mean, you can always, go back in the history of linguistics and find, a way to find where actually to base the term languaging. But the term itself is actually new. And if you go back in history, I mean, languaging, it's not a term that is mainstream term. We cannot say it's a mainstream term. If you actually look within cognitive linguistics, hardly you can find an article with the title languaging. So that's different from trying to find into history an interpretation where you can actually base the term language or active language. That's a different thing. Well, I agree with you. Okay.
Okay. Now, languaging is a vague term and cannot be the basis for human language.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I disagree.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, it is true that languaging is a vague term. There are many definitions of language and so forth. Perhaps I have not made it clear enough what language is for me.
Mm.
So let me try to explain it. Okay. During the first year of life, the child, the infant child, goes through a process of building a modeling system that represents the world. So, giving meaning to things, to objects, and so forth. The problem is that in our species, there is a parallel process to build a world of names. And that is the difference, building a world of names. That's what was my independent. So, and building a world of names is a presupposition for language. Mm-hmm. That's why I don't agree with languaging. Because you must interpret it. We have modeling systems in the brain which help us to interpret the world and recognize it and name it and so forth. All animals have these, but only we have a cognitive world of names. And that's where the difference is. There is a finite period in which animals build the world of objects. And so there is a finite period in which we build a world of names. Without grammar, without syntax, just giving meaning to sounds. That's the basis of it. Now, that is my view of languaging, so building a world of names in parallel with the process by which a child builds a world of objects. Okay? From that point of view, building a world of names is the presupposition for language. I mean, you can have language if you first do not have a world of names. Okay? That's my... So, it is true that this interpretation of languaging is different from many others' interpretation, but the connection with language is absolutely essential, because building a world of names is the basis for language itself. And then language has other phases, including the phases in which there must be shared words, shared interpretation, syntax, and so forth. So the world of names becomes structured, and it becomes rules and so forth. But if you see it from this point of view, it's pretty clear. I mean, all animals build a world of objects at the beginning of their life. Only humans build also a world and building a world of names is a real process. It's not a fantasy or something. It's a real process, and it's got a mechanism. Okay, it's not yet language proper because there is no syntax for it. But as I said, it is equally important to build the world of names as to build the world of objects. So if you see from that point of view, there are two biological processes. Okay? For a child, building a world of names is as important as building a world of objects. Okay? And that's the difference. Animals do not have a world of words. I mean, animals look at the object, if they see the object, a child recognizes an object by hearing his name.
So if I call my dog, he wouldn't listen? If I call my dog, he wouldn't listen? You were suggesting?
Okay, so you see, these two different worlds,
How?
the world of names and the world of objects, are real worlds that belongs to the development of the child. They're not fantasies. That mean they are there, they exist. Perhaps we don't understand yet the real mechanism and so forth. But we must start from the fact that the very beginning of language is building a world of names without syntax, without any other rules, just giving meaning to sounds. And that's a real process. That's how it is. So this is not the usual interpretation of language. Perhaps I have taken it as an arbitrary assumption. Perhaps I should have thought of a different word, but in a way, language has got some intuitive meaning, which is a presupposition for language, a mechanism that comes before and is necessary. And what comes before is the necessary is building a word or names, okay, in which the child learns to recognize something by hearing the names, not by just seeing. So I hope that this makes...
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to add just one thing, if I may. When I went to the references, Professor Barbieri, when I went to the references, I actually went to the references that you put in your book. So I went to see what actually they view languages are. And I'm sure you are not committed to their definition. Now I understand that you are not committed to their definition, and that's fine. But then, again, as you said, that you need, for language to be there, you need a mechanism to naming things around. But then this is reference, what we call in linguistics, reference. So why calling it languaging and talk about the whole process of activity if one term can do? Yeah, I mean, because it's confusing, Yeah. There are other points, I'm sure, but I don't want to take the time of the person after me, so thank you so much for, sorry.
Yeah,
so,
I just
sorry.
wanted to add a few things. I'm sure Marcello will correct me, but my understanding of the concept of linguistic codes fits the evolutionary plan. It's a very broad title. I agree with you that languaging doesn't mean a thing, and it's a modern coined term, just like minding. They don't mean anything. However, there are many, many developmental studies, starting from Piaget, that show how language is learned. It's learned by imitation, right? And it's not It's not a code in and of itself, it's a system of signs
Yeah.
that only very gradually become symbolic.
And it's mentioned in
Okay,
Professor
so
Barre's book.
I just
Piaget,
wanted to
yeah,
say
yeah.
that there's many developmental studies on language.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Then it's time for Camilla. You are welcome. The Camilla talk is titled Code Biology and Abduction in the Recreative Process.
So good evening to all, and very thankful and glad to be here. And so I want, first of all, to thank the organizer of the conference. And now I will start my presentation. Just a second. Just a few technical problems that precede all the speech.
Okay.
Thank you. So, my presentation, as you see in the title, is on abduction and the creative process on the light of code biology, of course. In my presentation, I will examine the extent to which the logical process of abduction is fundamental to creative process or the emergence of nobility. I will first define what the process of abduction is, as it was first presented by Charles Sanders Peirce and then revised by a number of scholars, especially in the field of semiotics. Most importantly, I will highlight the relevance of theorizing abduction within code biology, which allows to be contextualized in a more ecosystemic perspective and geared towards the study of complex phenomena such as creativity. Finally, I will give some example of application of the concept in the field of design. The concept of abduction was first formulated by Peirce as part of his theory of logic, in which the American philosopher added a third type in contrast to the classical Aristotelian division of the types of inference into deduction and induction, of course, the abduction. According to Peirce, abduction is a type of logical inference that enables an immediate jump to conclusion throughout best guessing. According to Peirce, this means, and I quote here, an originary argument or abduction is an argument which presents effects in its premise which present a similarity to the fact stated in the conclusion, but which could perfectly well be true without the latter being so, much more without its being recognized. So that we are not led to assert the conclusion positively, but we are wholly inclined towards admitting its representing a fact of which the facts of a premise constitute an icon. Yes, here in the slide you can see also another definition by Peirce of abduction, that is the most famous one, but for me the most important for creativity is the definition that I now quote. So, I thought the definition may seem somewhat confusing at first sight, as is often typical to Peirce writings. The key element to emphasize is that abduction will be a type of logic based on similarity between the facts asserted and the premise and those in the conclusion. To summarize, compared to the other two types of logical inference, in deduction, the rule and the case from which the result is derived are known, whereas in induction, the case and the rule are derived by repeating the results, where abduction is the weaker form of reasoning because it is a risky attempt to create a system of rules. The difference can be clearly seen in this diagram by Umberto Eco's books Semiotics and the Philosophy of Language. However, The fact that abduction is a weak form of reasoning does not mean that it is also the least common or useful. On the contrary, it represents the basic instinctive ability to guess correctly. It is no coincidence that logical reasoning by abduction is associated with the character of Arthur Conan Doyle, famous London detective, Sherlock Holmes, of course. In this context, I refer to the book The Sign of Dread, Holmes, Dupin and Peirce, published in 1983 by Umberto Eco and Thomas Zivok. Anything but incidental reasoning, abduction will be the basis of knowledge and discoveries, including scientific one. It is the most accurate inference. Abduction causes concept to take shape throughout a process in which a new concept is derived in the basis of an existing concept. Extending the discourse on abduction to a more ecosystemic and cybernetic sphere, I also propose here the definition of anthropologist and philosopher Gregory Bateson, who argues that abduction is, and I quote, a lateral extension of abstract components of description. In other words, Bateson argues that abduction is a way of knowing the reality around us in a deeper way than others because it's based on observation and analogy. Abduction would allow us to starting from something we already know, to detect other cases that can be unified by the same rule. Abduction will therefore be the heart of making connection that can provide us with information about something that we do not yet know, thus shifting meanings into another sphere so that we can see things in a different light or from a different perspective. It is an explanatory hypothesis given by driving force that arises from interaction with the world and that enables us to grasp, to comprehend connection that previously had no specific meaning. In this sense, abduction, for Bateson, resembles a metaphorical process, and it is a type of reasoning common to science as well as art, religion as well as poetic. If a specific aim of a presentation is to propose an hypothesis for the study of abduction in the creative domain, Bateson's definition proves useful. Indeed, it is very similar to what Victoria Alexander, here, defines as stochastic resonance, a process that underlines creativity. According to Alexander, creativity at the level of neuronal dynamics can actually present itself as a complex association that have nothing to do with the thoughts one is having at that particular moment, and that happen to be stimulated and reinforced by seemingly irrelevant stimuli and associations. Put more simply, it is the Newton classic apple of a discovery of gravity, or more mundanely, the joke that the best ideas are always born in the shower. Stochastic resonance is defined by Alexander as meaningful luck, a luck that is not pure chance, where coincidentally interrelated similarity reinforce what was previously considered irrelevant and became part of a process. Stochastic resonance can go in a more or less predictable direction, or create a novelty, or, in other cases, lead to misinterpretation. Abduction, as best guessing or jumping to a conclusion, has the same properties as Alexander's stochastic resonance, and can similarly tend to lead to the emergence of novelty, and thus creativity, but can also lead to misinterpretation. As I have already mentioned, abductive inference is the weakest, but at the same time, the most fundamental for the emergence of novelty. In order to create a link between the aforementioned theory and deepen the analysis of the abductive process, also from an ecosystemic perspective, I found useful to use the tool offered by the theory developed in the field of code biology. According to Barbieri, abduction is not a generic logical function, but a vital process that enables humans and other animals to make interpretation of signals in their surrounding environment, with three processes required for interpretation: coding, decoding, and abduction. Abduction, that is, enables most animals, including a human, of course, to interpret what is happening in the world and act in it through this process of guessing between a limited number of experiences. The abductive process would thus be the basis of what in code biologists call the second cognitive system, where chains of neural networks would allow a series of discrete memories to be unified and then jump to a conclusion. Interpretation and abduction are strongly linked here, where the ability to arrive at conclusions, a bit precarious or requiring further development, is based on various factors, such as training, knowledge, or circumstances. Another characteristic of abduction is that the more trained the mind is, the more effective it is, as Louis Pasteur, for example, will say. If Sherlock Holmes, unlike his faithful, sometimes somewhat obtuse companion John Watson, managed to solve a case on the basis of a few and seemingly irrelevant clues, it is because his mind is trained in this kind of logical inference, contains more elements from which we can make this kind of association, and last but not least, is it a great observer of reality around him. The neural networks, the protagonists of the abductive process in the theory of code biology, are in fact extremely powerful tools that can create not only feedback loops, but also memory of previous situation. A set of such memories enables learning and interpretation. In a sense, one could put forward the idea that the greater these memories of previous situations, the greater the likelihood that the process of abduction, or jumping to the conclusion, will be effective and not deceptive. Abduction is thus an essential tool for moving around in the world and interpreting it, or for making correct hypotheses that explain a phenomenon that is not yet known, also due to the fact that it does not necessarily require abstract and symbolic mental activity, typical to the possible reworking of information discovered through abduction. In this sense, abduction could be defined as an unconscious process useful for the formation of archetypes and representation of the world. In this context, I refer to the study already carried out in the field of code biology, in particular that of Anna Ragno, who argues in favor of a multi-layered model of mind in which the functions of a deep unconscious human form the basis of some symbolic abstract cognition, or the study of Mayer, who proposed the idea of the existence of a collective unconscious as a set of biological archetypes subject to evolutionary laws that enables the various representation in the human species. Starting from this premise, we began to outline how abduction is fundamental in the creative process, that is, in the process of the emergence of novelty. As well as we have seen, abduction does not necessarily imply creativity. But on the other hand, creativity also implies abduction. In other words, abduction may not even lead to the emergence of novelty. It may, for example, lead to misinterpretation. But if there is a creative process, it is based on abduction. Abduction, in the sense of creativity, is in fact a process of combining different sets of memories of what has already happened or habits into something new. Creativity is never a creation out of nothing, but also requires the presence of a conservative element, the memory, and the dynamic part, the non-deterministic way in which memories are connected in abduction. The artist, for example, does not create a painting out of nothing, but must combine in a non-deterministic way already existing elements of memory, such as technique, training, personal experience, elements of the era in which he lives, previous observation, and much more. To deepen the topic, it is therefore necessary to take a look at the creative disciplines, such as design, which have already dealt with the relationship between abduction and the emergence of novelty. Peirce already argued that abductive inference is the only kind of inference that can produce new ideas, which are then verified by deduction and/or induction. Abduction is indeed the ability to create ideas from surprising and unknown facts, and this is the main feature is shared with design process. Here an example of design process. You can see the circularity of it. So, both the design process and the abductive process are closed, circular feedback systems. Both have their stimulus in something that creates an interpretative problem of something that is different from habit, but at the same time tends to create a new habit throughout successive revisions. Both translate the possibility of creating prefiguration of a possible. So, the process of abduction is therefore not only useful for design, but the two processes actually coincide. Howard Kroll and Laurie Koskela are the scholars who have most thoroughly explored the link between design and abduction and identify the main types of abductive inference used in design. Specifically, they identify 7 main types. The first one is abductive regressive inference. This is, in their view, the most classic one, which Peirce describes as the inference useful for scientific discovery. It is a regressive inference that starts from effects and leads to a hypothetical cause. Second, abductive composition. This is an abstract, spatial, and relational arrangement of the components of a system that can be interpreted as a new idea in its context. It is a creative composition that is very similar to what Claude Lévi-Strauss defined as bricolage, whatever of ideas or materials. The third, number 3, manipulative abduction. This type of abduction was first introduced by Lorenzo Magnani, who understands it as an inference that occurs when we think by doing and not about doing. In other words, manipulative abduction is the kind of logic that works throughout embodied action. 4, abductive transformation. This is an example of a strategic use of abduction, where it is used to create not an immediate hypothetical solution, but a new problem that may be easier to solve than the first and the original one. 5, abductive decomposition. Here, decomposition means the division of a whole into its components, whereby the whole can be a system or a function. This technique was already used by Plato, for example. Number 6, abductive analogical reasoning. Is an abduction based on the formation of analogies. which is studied in various forms in the field of design and is also called design by analogy. Thus can be analogy based on form, for example, visual analogy, or analogies based on common physical principles. One example is biomimicry, the most famous one, which is based on the use of analogies taken from the biological world and contextualized in the field of product design. Number 7, abductive invention of requirements. This is a type of abduction that leads to the discovery of new desired function or implicit constraints which provide additional insights into the design problem to be solved. It often leads to unexpected results. So, in conclusion, abduction is a very complex system, and the proposed theories are often inadequate or even contradictory. The presentation itself is not intended to be a conclusive thesis, but rather an encouragement to further develop the study of the relationship between abduction and creativity. An investigation that I believe is conducted within the framework and with the tool of code biology. The points that I consider fundamental and which leave more room for discussion are the following. The first one is that abduction does not necessarily imply creativity, but on the other hand, creativity implies and takes its starting point from abduction. Creativity is never a creation out of nothing, but always requires the presence of a conservative element, the memory, and the dynamic part of the non-deterministic way in which memories are connected in abduction. Thank you for your attention. I'm in time?
No, we have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Camilla. This is really interesting. I agree with your conclusions. My questions are clarificatory, and they have to do with stepping back, right, to the beginnings. So, and this is something I've asked in Charles Peirce Society meetings, and I just don't understand. So deduction allegedly goes from general to specific, and induction from specific individual cases to a general principle. But, I mean, everybody knows that Aristotle has that AAA2 form of the categorical syllogism, which is all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's, and so we don't have any...
example.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the 15, right, valid ones. And so it's not, there are no individual cases in the premises there. And then abduction, I always understood as a fact set to inference to the best explanation. And that's why what you say here about abduction doesn't imply creativity necessarily, but creativity certainly implies induction. Mm-hmm. And I agree also that abduction somehow is not a logical process, but what I'd like, first of all, I'd like if you know the answer to that question and why everybody says deduction is from universal to a specific case. I'd love to hear that because I never understand that. But the other thing is that this seems exactly to align with contemporary neuroscientific explanations of brains as predicting machines, right? So brains creating generative models then provide for you the options for the best possible explanations, and that would be easy enough to do with dogs and cats and worms and everything else that have neurons, because then they're automatically going to build a generative model of the world, and that generative model then creates the possibility space for what could count as the best explanation. So are you thinking of that all the way down to that was question one's deduction, question two is Are you thinking about that all the way down to the neurological basis of creating generative models from which then we match patterns to patterns in the world, and then to the extent that we have to extrapolate, then that is the abductive move?
Oh, okay, thank you for your question. Yeah, very difficult questions. And first of all, I think I could maybe ask your question with an example that is very studied in artificial intelligence. For example, that of metaphor. Abduction, in my opinion, for my studies, is very, very similar to metaphor. So we recontextualize in another context something, and so I see it on another light. So, for example, in artificial intelligence, we cannot reproduce metaphors. We try to do it, and so in my opinion, abduction too. Abduction is part of a creative process in the sense that this is the first step to create something, to approach to the environment, to approach to our surrounding. Then I can pass to deduction and induction, but first of all, the first step is always abduction, and it's not, I cannot reproduce it with some mechanical systems. Okay, maybe.
Now, this is a tricky question. Can abduction takes place in the cell? In the cell. Can abduction take place in the cell?
In the self?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now there is a lot of problems behind this, but
it's in the self, is, in my opinion, is not possible. Because if we go to the very origin of abduction, we cannot speak about self as the loneliness person or so on.
Yeah, but yeah?
You ask self or cell?
Cell.
Cells?
In the cell, the cellular system.
Ah, cellular. Okay. Oh my God.
No, I'm saying.
No, in my opinion, no, because it's a second cognitive system, so it's part of.
But here there is a whole problem of abduction is interpretation, is linked to interpretation.
Yeah.
And interpretation for many people takes place in the cell.
No.
So, okay, and that, I think this is one of the biggest questions about these terms, both abduction and interpretation. Where do they take place in all living systems? And we have these two versions, as you know. Somebody says that abduction and interpretation takes place even in the cell, in the smallest thing. And others say no, they are the products of evolution, they require a representation of the world and so forth. So, as I said, it was a tricky question because there are two sides and two possible answers to this.
Yeah, for example, for Peirce, interpretation is profused in the word. but for code biology, of course, no.
Yeah.
So abduction take place, but in my opinion, the creativity too take place in the second cognitive system.
Yeah.
So something that is not a cellular system, of
Okay.
course.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, I think the problems with the definition of abduction stem from the fact that it's very heterogeneous, and there are two processes which we kind of lump together. One of them is that it's circular, so it's a second order cybernetics, as Stuart Appleby says, yeah, which is no problem at all for the reasoning. But and the second case is what you call the limited observation of data, from which there's an inference, yeah. But to your question, I would actually second your opinion that it's essential for creativity, because that might be the answer to the question why, well, at least in traditional view, machines are not creative, because if you ask the computer to give you an answer, it will compute and kind of exhaust all the logical possibilities and give you the answer at the end. But well, actually living beings can't do it because it's very costly, and they actually never do. And that's why I think the difference is not necessarily between creative and non-creative behavior, but between, well, going back to the discussion of Schrödinger, between life and other forms of self-organization. Because for life, you would say you would have to make those creative kind of judgments based of limited observation, and if you have a goal, such survival, for example. And if you don't have this goal, then you would probably just keep computing and going all the logical rules one after another. And it won't change if it's circular, because then it won't be abduction anymore. So thermostat is also circular, but it won't generate any new information. Yeah, it'll just stay on equilibrium.
Yeah, feedback system.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No other? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Camilla. Kirill is not here, no? Yeah, Kirill? Ah, you are. Excuse me. Excuse me. Oh, so, please, yes, it's your time. Fine. Excuse me. I was realized another people with this first name, Kirill, first one. Yeah. The talk is why narratives, the evolutionary necessity of narrations in natural and social world.
Great, thanks. Okay, I will start with thanks and a couple of disclaimers. I should thank the organizers for taking the risk of inviting me, although I have very little relation to biology, maybe as a living being. At best, I am trained as a literary scholar and has worked as sociologist, cultural sociologist, and now in the Faculty of Political History. And then I discussed this presentation with a couple of colleagues and was hoping actually to hide behind their backs their biological, white biological shoulders. So Don Favreau and Keith Farrenworth, but none of them is here, so I have to sort of take full responsibility for what I'm doing. Well, the main idea is that there should be some evolutionary necessity for narratives, and I would try to explain it and hope you will be indulgent when I venture into the biological terrain. So we could actually go back to the living systems which are recurrently discussed today, beginning with Schrödinger's work and then with Norbert Wiener's notion of cybernetics, which goes in this direction. So I'm referring to the classical definition of life, which is information increase, general information increase, as opposed to the entropy increase in open systems. So Ludwig von Bertalanffy, one of the founders of system theory in the natural sciences, says, in all irreversible processes, entropy must increase. Therefore, the change of entropy in closed system is always positive. Order is continually destroyed. In open systems, however, we have not only production of entropy due to reversible processes, but also import of entropy, which may well be negative. So this is the case in the living organism, which imports complex molecules high in free energy. Thus, living systems, maintaining themselves in a steady state, can avoid the increase of entropy and may even develop towards states of increased order and organization. So that's what makes them actually living systems and what keeps them alive. Now, the next step is that this information increase or energy intake, if we go one level down, is a product of interaction, which could take different shapes. So information wouldn't increase until some kind of change, energetic exchange would happen. James Miller says, one of the founders of, first pioneers, partisans of system theory in the States, says, which aspects of the transmission is most important depends upon how it is handled by the receiver. If the receiver responds primarily to the material of energetic aspect, it's a matter energy transmission. If the response is primarily to the information, it's an information transmission. So for example, the banana eaten by a monkey is a non-random arrangement of specific molecules and thus has its informational aspect. But its use to the monkey is chiefly to increase the energy available to him. So in other words, there are two aspects. One of them is, there are two aspects in consuming order, so this order, which is a non-random arrangement of molecules, is what gives this system, this particular system, monkey, a chance of living further. It's his or its interaction or her interaction with the environment. Yeah? In this case, the import of energy. But if we look at the human interaction by means of language, we could see more or less the same. So whenever we get information, we get it by interaction. Yeah? There are no other ways. The basic semantics of talk and other conduct, I'm quoting the founding father of conversation analysis, Emanuel Menis-Sheglov. The basic semantics of talk and other conduct and talk in interaction is directional and progressional towards positive completion of whatever units compose the several orders of organization in play at any given moment. This macro projection are always realized by progress at the local bit-to-bit organization. The local organizations in micro projections are tailored, shaped, and interpreted by reference to the developing project of the overall structural organization currently in the works. So conversation theory has a slightly insular language. So what Menis-Sheglov means basically is that there's a continuous interaction with the environment in the process of conversation, and information intake by means of conversation is the behavior which also sort of bolsters our survival and it works towards this goal by taking information in from conversation by means of language. So the processes look more or less similar. The one described by Miller and this one described by Sherlock. Now, the vexing question, it's the way I formulate it. Both in social and natural world, systems preserve and develop themselves through various forms of interaction. Energy transfers, exchanges of cues and random signals, focused conversational cooperation, and so on. Given this fact, it's not immediately clear why narratives, the messages which can be used in interaction without recording, are necessary at all. Yeah? So, when we talk about narratives, we will go to a much more detailed discussion of it, but basically we'll talk about some chunks of information stored, buried, or otherwise preserved somewhere, somewhere where there's no immediate interactional access is possible, so I think one interesting point about how narratives and interaction are coordinated, at least the first I would say legible formulation of this, because von Neumann's formulation is hardly legible, goes back to Keith Farnsworth, who says the following: because information can only contribute as formal cause to efficient cause within the domain of its embodiment, translation can extend or restrict the range over which information is effective. Closure to efficient causation requires internalized information to be isolated from the cycle of efficient causes that it informs. So that's where narratives are actually created, so isolated. And do not partake in this give and take. For Neumann, self-replicator requires a template, source of information that is causally isolated from the physical replication system, which is, let's say, use of this information and interaction. Life operationalizes this isolation with a genetic code, translating from the isolated domain of codons to that of protein interactions. So that's where we have the link. Yeah, we have the link between what we could call narratives in culture, in human superstructures, and narratives in nature. So we could start with the latter in Marshall Poe's History of Communication. It's a rare example where he gives a serious treatment, alternative treatment to the processes, to the texts and to the processes of interaction. He shows their connection without presupposing that it's one and the same in different shapes, which is very instructive, I think, because then we could see where actually narratives are located, where they're buried. If you're going to write and read, you need the equipment, pen, paper, and a primer. Once you've got the tools, you need to learn to encode and decode. That's not easy. It takes healthy children several years of instruction to gain moderate writing and reading proficiency in their native language. Yeah. Which basically means that it's not just two different shapes of language which are somehow perpetually interlinked. No. There is a certain system of rules embodied in rules, customs, and having a certain code, definitely, which is not immediately available in interaction. One have to have access to this. It's very, very important. So going back to this question of interaction between mother and the child, if there would be no memory with all this rules stored, they will always invent this interaction from the scratch. So then all mothers and children would speak different languages and people wouldn't be able to interact. So definitely, those rules are definitely there, but they're not immediately available. You have to learn to access them. You have to translate from those rules to interaction and back. And apparently the closest example in which we could see in nature is the transcription. Yeah, DNA is served through a process wherein specific DNA nucleotide sequences genes are transcribed into relative transient messengers, RNA, mRNA polymers. The mRNA, in turn, serves as a template for the formation of structural, regulatory, and catalytic proteins from amino acids. The formation of a protein is the ultimate form of expression of the programmed genetic message provided by the nucleotide sentence of a gene. Yeah. So again, that's how this, we could say, information which is stored somewhere, buried somewhere, is put into interaction and is serving to the creation of life and its survival. Now, once we established the isomorphism between human communication, well, human social communication and genetic communication, human codes and genetic codes, as Marcel Barbieri does in the organic codes. So there's the meaning of a combination of dots and dashes is a letter of the alphabet in the Morse code, and the meaning of a combination of three nucleotides is usually an amino acid is the genetic code. So when the sentences are isomorph, we can see what actually makes out narratives. Yeah? One of those features is that they're isolated, going back to Farnsworth formulation, isolated from specific interaction. They're stored somewhere. And if they're not stored, then we are descending into chaotic bellum omnium contra omnes, or other chaotic behavior where people interact according to, or let's say other creatures interact according to unspecified and constantly changing rules. So that's why Howard Garfinkel, from his sociological standpoint, states that without the distinction between objective and indexical expressions, and without the preferred use of objective expressions, the victories of generalizing rigorous scientific inquiries, logic, mathematics, some of the physical sciences are unintelligible. It's not necessarily a very good, objective is not necessarily a very good term, but we can see what he's aiming at. That those rules, like logic, mathematics, I would say were those two, cannot be constantly updated in the process of interaction in order to preserve communication across, let's say, generations or at least certain periods of time. They have to be kind of shielded from those interactional adjustments. Yeah? And that he means for social rules as well. And in a more accessible language, the same is said by Alice Hahn, sociologist. The distinction between pockets of experience that relate to what can be perceived and those that relate to assumptions of transcendence, at least in the level of elaboration that makes itself accessible for self-thematization, only becomes possible with writing as a form of communication. Yeah? So distinction between experience and perception and, let's say, abstraction from those parts is only possible when we have writing, when we have a narrative, an encoded and shielded, buried part of our knowledge. So what von Neumann calls memory. Now, those narratives preserve information over multiple generations through their invariance to environment. So, like thousands of stretches of DNA have remained unchanged in humans and other primates over very long periods. But if we look at symbolic communication at language, we have the same argument. So Niklas Luhmann says that historical reason for the development of the symbolic communication appears to have been the invention and spread of writing. So again, we are talking about writing, which immensely expanded society's communication potential beyond interaction and presence, and thus removed it from the control of specific interaction systems. Again, we have a certain encoded set of encoded messages which are removed from the, he says, from the recursive interference of specific interaction. We have certain texts, so the books don't, the content of the books, let's say the content of the books by itself doesn't change by interaction. You have to recode it, you have to read it or look at it and retell someone. By itself it could be buried, and so it's a narrative which is not immediately affected by interaction, by conversations between actual human beings in actual space. As a result, there's a developed mythology of narrative of something sacred, something fragile, which usually corresponds to the actually fragility, and also since those are the chunks of information which are preserved, as we saw, particularly in nature, over very long periods of time, this information is considered universal and applicable to very different phenomena. So that happens to the sacred texts of monotheism, particularly in the Old Testament and the text around it. So I will quote for Arnold Goldberg, who talks about the destruction of context as a presupposition for canonization. The writing became sacred writing for the rabbis. That is, all other context of this literature had to be abandoned in favor of new context, written revelation and all its circumstances. The canonization of writing in no way arose the need for monosemization. Only the sign itself had to be secured by tradition, while its meaning became completely open to constant new interpretation. So, yeah, whenever sacred text exists, whenever something happens, whenever there is a certain situation where they could be accessed and kind of translated by interpretation, they're actual. They can be obsolete or outdated or even intelligible. And what were the meaning before doesn't really matter. Yeah, they're always actual. They're always available for this translation and for the creation of, for explaining, for example, circumstances of life. That's what happens to Bible actually every week on Sunday in churches. Yeah, and the same could be said. This idea of fragility, of necessity to shield the narrative from destruction, appears in the discussion of DNA. So the organism cannot be computed directly from the DNA without the loss of critical information. Yeah? In this context, science as boundary condition mediate the biological construction in a way that prevents the loss of information and destabilization of the DNA through this interaction. And so I hope that in very tentative steps I sketched out my view of why narratives are necessary, why they're preserved, why they're separated, isolated from the actual interaction, and whether it could be relevant for not only for, let's say, human social perception of culture, but also for the natural evolutionary processes. That's up to you to decide. And with thanks to those who helped me and those who funded this trip, my project Practice of Comparing, I thank you for your attention.
We have time for questions. Please. Someone? Yeah.
Thank you so much. The issue of narrative is very important to me because I am, unluckily enough, I am a post-Gramscian semiotician, something like that, so narratives are important for what I do. You displayed a series of phenomena that are definitely related one to the other. At the same time, each and one of them give us a facet of the idea of narrative. But I wanted to ask you something more in order to better understand what is your position regarding atomic, I would say, definition of narrative. Because some of them were on the side of the idea of what is a story, which is next to what you were discussing regarding the exchange of energy, for example, namely a change of state from A to B, from T1 to T2, something like that. And some of the things that you were discussing were related to this narrative as story, okay? So the tradition that in narratology, structuralism is Jeanette, for example. And on the other hand, there were some phenomena that were way into the idea, for example, the DNA thing was more on the side of series, a series of phenomena that are chained one to the other. And so the main definition between story and series in this respect is a kind of difference of aspectuality, because we have diachrony in the first case, story, but iteration in the second case. So the DNA thing and the idea of making a parallel between narrative and DNA stresses on this side. So I just was curious to know if you back more a possible parallel between story and narrative, or series and narrative.
I see.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a fascinating question, and actually a very helpful one to think further about it. Well, narrative is a coded message. Yeah, we have certain signs, certain signifier relations which are arranged sequentially. We're accustomed to talking about narratives as in culture as something written, but it's not necessarily the case. We have oral narratives before writing, but they're also placed in the memory. So if you read Albert Lord's The Singer of Tales, the classical book about how the oral epos was preserved, it's essentially the same with the difference, but that is difficult for human beings for natural reasons to preserve narratives in their memory. They tend to forget things, and forgetting has important biological functions, so they can't not forget. And then things get destroyed. So narratives were actually distributed along the specially prioritized groups of singers, and were passed on from one generation to another. It's a very fragile form, and we have much more entropy in it than in the written texts, because they are not dependent, not so dependent on physical memory, and so it's not necessarily in human case writing or oral form. As far as the sequentiality versus iteration, it's a very interesting question, because precisely in the forms of narratives which are perishable in, let's say, in the human forms of narratives with a perishable, iteration is very common. So in poetry, we have obviously iteration based on the fact that we have lines of the same length, usually lines of the same length. In many languages we have rhyme in poetry, or we have rhyme in prose in early Byzantine literature. We have alliteration, assonances in the cultures which didn't have any writing at all, like Icelandic Edda. We have tremendous number of repetitions on the phonic level, so it's all composed of alliterations for the sake of better preservation. There the narrativity is not so important. So I would say, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer the relation, but I will certainly think about it, how important iteration is if we compare, let's say, natural narratives and cultural narratives.
The question of narratives in the context of genetic material is interesting, especially because there are two main things. Axons are thought to be to have a form of coded regions, while the majority of genome, which are introns, from the 19th were extensively investigated, and they are thought to have structure of non-coded text.
Yeah.
So basically, to be even more complicated, the coded regions have ordered and disordered sequences, which are completely different in function, different in structure, and different in transmitting biological message.
Yeah.
However, the truth function which structured those and defined physical-chemically ordered and disordered regions is the same. The only difference is in accuracy of the structure determination. So to make it short, where do you have any idea, can you speculate, where to try to find narratives in such a complex situation, rather in coding regions that do the function and evolutionary aspects do actually phenotype, or in non-coding regions, which are majority of genome, which we are not at the moment fully aware of all the complex things they do, and they are also pulled for many other different types of DNA molecules and so on and so on. Where to find narratives and how to explore them. Could we use some social, political science methodology, or can you speculate on some specific tests, for example? And locations. When you have a coding and non-coding regions, and when you have encoded regions, order and disorder.
No, that's that's a very interesting question for which I have no specific answer. Certainly, we're accustomed to thinking of narratives in terms of sequentiality, which means that there is certain added value in the fact that we place signs one after another, and not just perceive them in a isolated way, which is kind of the very minimal definition of a narrative. So they're arranged sequentially. But I understand since non-coding DNA is on the first glance, it's kind of the crux of.
Compare coded and non-coded text.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the people who can actually do it best are, there's a big group of people actually mostly located in Italy which works on the first alphabets and on the fact how alphabets were created. And that's the right, I can fetch you a reference. Yeah, that's because if you find the alphabet, if you find the code, and if you make sure the code is, then you probably make the next step to the narrative. That's what I would answer.
I just wanted to say one thing, can I? We have time? I was actually rather surprised at the angle you've taken on narrative. Paleological studies infer that naming the words contain the story condensed within them, and that narrative would have evolved with human cognition. In fact, there's evidence of this in the writings that began in chronological lists and then became heroic stories, but that narrative is at the very basis of language. So I can't find the connection between the various subjects you took up to discuss narratology. Maybe you could just explain something about that, or in some way justify it.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I agree completely, and I would say I don't know what about biological narratives, but the stability of human narratives is certainly exaggerated. Because with canonic texts, for example, the canonic texts of the New Testament, it's an interesting story that the idea that they're kind of, all these features, that they are fragile, that they're sacred, that they are helpful to explain every context in every conceivable situation, that they don't change. This idea predates the actual canonization of the texts. Yeah, so there are 2-3 centuries passed before actually the apocryphs and the sacred text were separated. So they were kind of, until the 3rd, 4th century, they were kind of kept together and different people meant different things. But that was the general idea that that was the case. So I don't doubt that narratives evolve, yeah? I just mean that whenever they evolve, they have a certain latency. Because they don't evolve the way our interaction evolves. It's slower. It's slower because they can't partake in interaction directly. And so they are preserved in the memory and they could be activated and reactivated, but that's a separate procedure. So narratives don't talk, yeah? They don't partake in interaction, they don't react. And this creates this latency and this gap. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's... No? Oh, well, then we can, I can try in the coffee break.
Okay, thank you very much. Now it's time for the coffee break.
Oh, thanks.
Noi, io ero ballerina, no? Guai! 15 minuti. Non è così, eh?
Sì, perfetto. It's time for the last session. So I'm really pleased to ask to Anna to present your talk or to read your talk.
Okay.
Please.
First of all, do you hear me very well? I will try to read very quickly because it's quite long paper. I left abstracts on all of the seats, so you have at least a beginning. Okay. This presentation is in 4 sections. I will read all 4, I hope. This presentation takes the Barbierian idea that new coding forms mark the advent of new eras and brings it up to date by examining the code that has reconfigured human life and is defining our new era, the algorithm. In tracing the adaptive course of human ingenuity, I chose toolmaking, which revealed 3 broad categories that are present from the start. For the hand that flaked the stone is also the hand that recorded lunar cycles and painted cave walls. Tools, signs, and representation interweave, engaging eyes, movement, and thought in feedback loops. Perception, kinetics, and cognition together evolved the human brain, mind, and intelligence. My primary interest is in all aspects of semiosis, in interaction, communication, imagination, and representation, believing that semiosis evolved through microbiological pathways involving neural connections, uniting body and mind that persist within a sensory motor matrix. I also considered the social adjustments created by new knowledge and technologies, from small agrarian groups to city-states. Each of these changed the fabric of how we live, communicate, assign meaning, and think, and each beckoned in a new coding form. Since so much material cannot be compressed into a short presentation, I have cut a lot of this paper. And now it is the paper proper. During the Second World War, preceding the London Blitz, as Britain braced for a German invasion, teams of the finest minds in electrical engineering, physics, mathematics, and the sciences on both sides of the Atlantic gathered to create air defense systems to intercept German planes and ways to decode communication. The first radar and ground-to-air missiles were 2 such inventions. Later came a decoding machine that detected patterns far more quickly and effectively than humans. Turing introduced the possibility of computer science, and Johnny von Neumann, who later built the first stored computer program, transformed the atomic age into a new computerized world order. Oh, I'm sorry, let me just continue. So, cybernetics, reifying information, programming machines. Wiener, Shannon, von Neumann. Overshadowing all the important post-war breakthroughs in electronics and biotechnology was the computer, programmed to process all kinds of information by transforming all input into binary digits in strings of 1s and 0s. We had entered the age of information. This paradigm shift was not lost on Norbert Wiener, professor at MIT, mathematician and scientist, who, in The Human Use of Human Beings, 1950, writes that he had begun working on a theory of messages as, quotes, a means of controlling machinery and society, the development of computing machines and other such automatic, close quotes. Reflecting on the nervous system, he drew parallels between the, quotes, internal transforming powers of the apparatus, whether alive or dead, close quotes. It is impossible here to cover the range of his ideas, but importantly, he couched them in a probabilistic framework. Looking for a name for this complex of ideas, Wiener landed on cybernetics, from the Greek kubernetes, steersman, a word that would spawn a veritable lexicon of cyber offspring in pop culture. From the start, he coupled communication with control, claiming, quote, society could only be understood through a study of messages and the means that facilitate them, close quotes, whether these are, quotes, between human and machine, machine and human, or machine and machine, close quotes. A vision that foresaw the growing role communication would play in the future. Ramifications of this cutting-edge conception spread, engaging avant-garde minds in lively multidisciplinary discussions, out of which evolved a solid conceptual foundation. The cybernetic framework took hold and exploded. Wiener's vision was vast, from electronic engineering to the life sciences. Like the human nervous system, the machine would yield output from input, much as we learn from experience. Once ideas are rarefied at such high levels of abstraction, it does not matter whether the input goes through a live sensorium or mechanized sensors. What matters is input and output. To me, writes Wiener, the fact that the signal has gone through a machine rather than a person is irrelevant, close quotes. What a loaded statement. A vital signal transmits via physical and semiotic means. Signs, symbols are always cognitively meaningful. Semiosis is our intermediary between interlocutors as well as our mediation between reality out there and our minds, processed via the human sensorium and nervous system at different levels of developmental organization, nothing like programmed machines. The line between living and non-living systems is already blurring at the outset. The purpose of cybernetics was to develop a vocabulary and technique that would enable humans to, quotes, attack the problems of control and communication in general, close quotes, and properly classify its manifestations within a unified framework. Wiener succeeded supremely in this, while setting in motion a conceptual revolution for good and ill that continues today in the far-flung ambition of creating a master learner with encyclopedic knowledge. His redefining information as the content of what is exchanged with the outer world fit with Shannon's mathematization of information. Working at the Bell Telephone Laboratories, mathematician and electrical engineer Shannon, inspired by a purely practical transmission problem, devised an infallible theorem, earning him the title of father of information theory. Together, they endowed information with its modern form. The next great breakthrough came from physicist, polyglot, and computer pioneer John von Neumann, among the first to conceive of computers as devices able to solve problems through applied mathematics. As early as 1945, he demonstrated that a computer could have a simple structure while executing any kind of computation when properly programmed, without hardware modification, thereby introducing the first stored computer program. In line with the philosophy of Leibniz, Wiener's intellectual synthesis had forged a way to quantify mechanisms of change within and between systems. This foundation, infused by experts from various sciences, launched by Shannon's theory and put into practice by von Neumann's contribution, become the nascent field of computer science. With a ubiquitous coding system, the mechanical foundations of computer software would be modeled efficiently and potentially with unlimited, even self-replicating capacities. But what then is this magical computation? How is it modeled? What does it do? Enter the algorithm, a human artifact, the key into which is locked a foolproof mathematical formula that performs a task more perfectly and consistently than any human can. An algorithm is a sequenced set of instructions to achieve a specific result. Once coded and programmed, it is reliable and infallible in delivering these results. The term algorithm originates in the name of the 9th century Persian Arab mathematician who invented algebra, Muhammad ibn Musa, Fahad help me, Khwarizmi, whatever, coming down to us from Latinized algoritmus to algorithm. We use algorithmic thinking when going through steps to accomplish any task, but the theorems devised by programmers accomplish astonishing tasks, and computers do them infinitely quicker and better. Those that manipulate the symbolic vocabulary that codes programs are artifact makers of our digital age. Computer programmers are its wizards. A mythos exploded around the advent of computers, generating a libertine drug culture in the 60s and 70s with euphoric promise of a freewheeling alternate cyberspace behind the screen and beyond the reach of conventional norms. It also captured creative minds. With antenna into the culture, artists proliferated the illusion of a virtual other world, embellishing possibilities with fanciful fantasies. The psychedelic guru of this era was Timothy Leary, a hyperbolic cult figure spreading word that virtual reality was better than LSD, that the cyber era would sideline the real world. New, unforeseeable forms of human-machine symbiosis were envisioned, advocating for organisms and machines to merge, creating new forms of life. If the boundaries of the cybernetic field were fuzzy to begin with, all boundaries dissolved in popular culture, where thinking machines were not just changing what we do, but who we would become. Analogies between the body and manufactured artifacts were not new. Wiener had used the nervous system to model his basic input-output feedback. Yet constant slippage between the thinking machine and the human mind equivalence keeps creeping in. Brains are said to function like machines in that the structure of a machine or organism determines what it may perform, leaving out volition, purpose, context, and emotion. As computer science evolved, these notions became even more ingrained. The cyber prefix mushroomed into cyborg, cyberdelic, cyberpunk, cyberspace, and more seriously, cyber war. This is not what Wiener intended. He feared that by ushering in more mechanization, the second industrial revolution could displace many workers, creating massive unemployment. And having witnessed what his fellow scientists had wreaked with the atomic bomb, he greatly mistrusted human Promethean hubris. Misconstrued as progenitor of a machine-era takeover, the real danger to society he saw was not from machines, but from human misuse of them. He abhorred the idea of push-button warfare, anticipating the mischief that could be wrought by those in power to control populations by means of machines. But moralizing aside, once communication had become a means of control, and information an entity, and once T. Berners-Lee had written the code for the World Wide Web, there was no stopping what Wiener, Shannon, and von Neumann had let loose on humanity. Wiener's message stands pristine, isolated, clean, and coded by Shannon's brilliant theorem, cleared of all the muddy murk of ambiguity or innuendo, of colorful tone and smirk, of mirth or mockery. Lost are both context and meaning, all that makes human communication human and defines a co-created semantic field. In their place is an inanimate interface fielded by a screen, its coded core responding to every command, emitting perfect, unlimited information on anything at all, whatever, whenever you need it. And Shannon's great contribution meant that if information could be computed and quantified, it could also be commercialized as a commodity and monetized. Worse, it could be stolen, falsified, manipulated, distorted, decontextualized, weaponized, and sliced and spliced into unrecognizable fragments of falsehoods. With the rapid rise of the PC, tensions between progress and trepidation already there grew as the culture accommodated this pervasive new instrument with the miraculous math genie inside. The computer would connect the world on an equalized virtual space where all are intertwined, all voices heard. It was the next frontier of limitless possibilities, spreading us to extended minds and alternate selves, artificial intelligence. The computer was a devious master distractor, forcing us into digital language, robbing our exchanges of human nuance, isolating and insulating us. It would weaken memory, steal our time, send us along addictively to keep following its clever enticements. Its virtual space, an unregulated alley rife for mischief and deviance. Vacillations between euphoria and dystopia typify all major innovations throughout history. Introducing new tools, except perhaps in farming, arouses suspicions, weighing what is gained against what is lost. Consider shifts from the engaging, poetic, tonal rhetoric of the oral tradition to writing, privately created and consumed. The lilting carriage to the smoky locomotive, cutting noisily through the fields. From horses, warm, alive, physically connected, to automobiles, cold, fast, and loud. From artisanship to assembly lines. Yet each of these spread to the many what had been reserved for a privileged few, democratizing orbits of knowledge, travel, and goods. Humans co-evolve with their tools. Our instruments empower us, feeding into the next generation's cognitive and socio-cultural changes. Yet the power of this new tool, its prodigious potential, and the enmeshment it threatens is unprecedented. Is it the lure of the device itself, or the allure of its multiple uses via an interior digital system guarded by a stern binary sentinel? On, off, 0, 1, yes, no. No shades of maybe, perhaps, what if, why not? A mystique evolved around the algorithm itself. After all, this was the slick theorem that made it all work. Invisible, all-powerful, with omnipotent qualities. Was the genie divine or demonic? A force for good or evil? Would this new coding system free us or entrap us? Serve us or usurp us? Next segment, tech takeover, friend or foe. The rise of the algorithm ushered in a mathematical world running silently on equations craven to, quotes, a theology of big data, in Finn's stark words. What Hames, already 30 years ago, labeled a regime of computation. A gigantic leviathan lurks behind the unassuming algorithm. Would that the already massive commercialization of human attention were enough. But human ingenuity never rests. The acceleration of progress pushes swiftly to the next quest. If a computed sequence of weighted numbers gave us Google, just imagine what an ultimate encyclopedic learner run by a master algorithm could do. So enormous is this ambition, it wants to capture a superordinate level of transcendent knowledge in AI. Quotes, if we can design machines that are more intelligent than us, they should be able to design machines that are more intelligent than them, and so on ad infinitum, leaving human intelligence far behind, writes Domingos, confidently confusing big data learners with human intelligence. I confess I maintain a deep faith that the humanities will survive this computational straitjacket, remaining alive and well, supported by everything that cannot be composed without human experience, our metaphors and poetry, our dreams, and spontaneous creative human imagination set free. And I am bemused by a story from the 1950s in which human judges are being replaced by mechanized cyber judges for the fact-based precision rulings. One remaining live judge who values emotions and empathy in human judgment remains doubtful, ending the story with the infallible mighty machine crashing ignominiously when asked to calculate the magnitude of dreams. Most features of human cognition cannot be quantified. They come from qualities of human intellection, into which converge sensibilities, perception, emotions, and meanings, accrued via layers of constant new sensory motor input, far from fixed calculations, but perhaps not beyond the efficacy of codes in storing memories. The thrust behind Barbieri's macroevolutionary theory originating in DNA is that codes bring about absolute novelties. His vision of a biology where organic codes are the artifacts of nature. Algorithms are human artifacts, and they are changing us. We are being swept along by a rip current of mathematical logic, of computable formulas that have become the rushing force of change in our daily lives, and more importantly, the way we filter our world. The empowering ideals of a free society, the autonomy valued by Emerson's self-reliance, and even the Hellenic psychoanalytic principle, know thyself, are being eroded by the certainty that AI machines can do us better, that we are being watched, pursued, and maybe eventually even conditioned, cured, and surpassed by inanimate programmed computers. The extraordinary efficacy of these computer codes and our drive to abstract and miniaturize our artifacts tempts us to believe that the universe indeed operates according to reducible mathematical principles, and that the human brain also runs on some form of neurological coding system, like the engram. Parallels between algorithmic efficiency and cerebral abstractions are readily found, but the latter originate in biological beginnings and continue issuing from a lifelong sensory motor matrix. Just as computer scientists strive to surpass the human brain, neuroscientists borrow computer analogies to decipher the puzzle of memory. Gallistel, an avant-garde neuroscientist, notes, quotes, "The search for the engram doesn't include the notion of a code, but the notion of a code is at the core of information theory and molecular biology," close quotes. Barbieri's code poetic theory is rigorous and open, says neuroscientist Recchia Luciani. It corresponds to two dominant neuroscientific hypotheses of cognition: the computational model, as in computers, and the connectionist model, as in neural networks. In a book peppered with soaring fantasies and deep equations, Berlinski explicitly links the algorithm to DNA, the foundational code that brings about absolute novelties. He depicts molecular transcription and replication as conveyors of secrets, not from one molecule to another, but from past into the future. But then he errs drastically in paralleling hardware and software, the machine hosting its algorithm, the human being, his mind. Cerebral neural functioning is essential to mind, but mind is not its brain matter. Mind is created, composed, cognized out of meanings, felt, semiotically represented, and constantly re-elaborated by an evolving, living, whole organism, moment to moment. Domingos go even further. He says, think of a big data as an extension of your senses and learning algorithms an extension of your brain. He brazenly asserts that we are all cyborgs already, anticipating that algorithms can take over human sensory experience. Really? And what of the dream? The deep unconscious creation that pictures felt experience. Sensory processing is as essential to human cognition as turning the switch on is to machine functioning. No algorithm will ever develop, as we do, from biological origins with tight-knit sensory, motor, emotive, cognitive faculties. The cybersphere is embedded in orbits of mathematical abstraction, but human abstractions, linguistic or numerical, are always articulated by a mind that has arrived at abstraction bottom up via a semiotic scale rooted in the body, achieving higher cognition through its own developing cognitive efforts, nothing that a programmed machine can accomplish. Buried under strata of abstractions in humans is the moist, fertile soil of the five senses. From these seeds grow experience and language, so that into the word flows a confluence of embodied signifiers, immediate and past, fitted to context, colored by purpose, delivered with inflections in tone, volume, rhythm, innuendos, implied or specific, in expressive verbal sequence. By contrast, the algorithmic word spurts, quick and cold, clean and clear, but senseless, aseptic, without context or purpose, posing performatively as if in dialogue, but actually an imposter with whom we engage in good faith. The computer bewitches us, urging us to merge with its disembodied, calculated enticements. This tilts an interface that tricks us into feeling that we are interacting with intelligent machines. It's okay for adults who know when to switch it off, but for the young, the new humans growing up, relating behind the screen, the merger is a hazardous trap. My final section, I explore the psychocognitive consequences of this computer-mediated world. Algorithmic culture, trending disembodiment. A cell phone in every pocket, a PC on every desk. Open the slim silver box, flick the switch, and the screen unlocks unlimited possibilities. You can chat with a friend, write an email, read the news, buy or sell anything, ask a question, Google answers, play music, read books, watch movies, find a flight, rent a room, plan a trip, book it, find a doctor, speak to one. A cornucopia of information is what the gadgets provide. Information is today's currency. What can be wrong? Nothing, if you are among those who can detect mis- or disinformation, who can turn it off, but most cannot. The gadgets are addictive. The convenience of a multitasking handheld tool is too great. And as always in human affairs, this instrument of instantaneous transmission can be misused. Mega-minded algorithmic programmers prey on addictive tendencies, targeting the young, naive, the greedy and needy, the fame seekers and the disenfranchised, the angry and the lonely. Everyone wants to be seen, heard, plugged in. Children cannot detach from screens they see adults tethered to. The medium has usurped the message. Behold, human life mediated by screens. Non ce la faccio, guarda, abbiamo cominciato alle 5:15. Corro. We have become a species of information mongers, knowing more and more about less and less. Time, mi hai distratto. We lose time absorbed in screen time. No time zone matters. Any time is time anywhere. The shrunken globe defies temporal and geographical boundaries wrapped in an internet. Okay, so I have to hurry on. Experiments show that our daily tools imprint into our brains, becoming extensions of our hands, arms, and legs. They become embodied. But never has there been a tool that supplements, extends, and surpasses or supplants our mental faculties. And if this is a problem for adults, it's a serious problem for the developing mind. For the young, still barely differentiated, entanglement is a given. They will use, like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, the algorithm will lure them on to keep staying on. So I have provided a list of what I can, measuring what is gained against what is lost, and the difficulty is with an unbiased mind, but here's a try. What is gained? Constant contact, a convenient handheld tool, infinite amounts of information anytime, sources for all manner of services and learning from home, opened horizons, comfort for the lonely and isolated, social media means for connections, meetings, discussions, debates. What is lost? Absence, attention span, slow process, deep reading, meaning, memory, silence, sublimation, restraint. What are the dangers? Weakening or loss of impulse control, inattention or divided attention, delegating memory, summary readings and writings, homework relegated to AI, shallow thinking, lack of concentration, impoverished imagination, falsification of information, grandiosity, exhibitionism, social media addiction, and Twitter poisoning. Do I have time? There are two key psychoanalytic things that we don't have time. Okay, so I will mention them because they're very important. The developmental consequences of these machines is the end of absence and sublimation, because separation in infancy creates the space of where the symbol is erected, so also imagination, and sublimation is the result of an unsatisfied desire. Nowadays, you can satisfy every desire just through the screen. Now, these are my closing statements, discussion and conclusion. What excited the first taste of the infinite possibility of other realities has become a global phenomenon in our time. The latest chat box can explain complex concepts in clear, punctuated prose. Tapping into these bots may feel like chatting with a person because they mimic intelligent conversation, but ask a complex question that requires subtle contextual assessment, and they reveal their imposter status. They do not really understand the situation. They remain fake responders, administering algorithmic recipes with formidable linguistic skills. Venus stripped messages of both interlocutor and content, and Shannon's theorem dealt a final blow by digitizing them. Human communication is polysemic, multi-layered, mediated by emotional signals and semiotics means by a sensorium that arrives at language via embodied experience. Okay, I will cut to the very end. The machine lacks judgment and does not grasp meanings, and there's the rub. AI cannot deal with concepts to which it has not already been exposed before. They cannot generate thought as human cognition. The symbolic function is the sine qua non of our unique adaptation, contingent on making tools for sure, but even more for conceiving of them through the mind's medium. In 2022, scientists named our era the Anthropocene, the age of humanity, yet we are becoming so removed from the natural world and our own nature, we risk losing that humanity altogether. The introduction of an innocent code has altered the course of human evolution, manifesting Barbieri's code poetic theory that broad evolutionary shifts are marked by the advent of new codes. To the molecular, neural, and cultural codes, we must now add the computational, a world created by the algorithm. Thank you. Scusatemi. I can't hear. Non sento. Scusami, non sento la domanda. Comunque se siamo...
Okay, so you said artificial intelligence is not capable of innovation. And my question...
Not capable of what?
Of innovation.
I am not a specialist in this.
No, I mean,
I'm a specialist in human communication.
Yeah, but I mean, you mentioned new things, you know, essentially new ideas, creative ideas.
Non ho capito.
So, my question is whether you believe that biological evolution is capable of true innovation, of making inventions.
If biological, say it again?
Evolution
is what?
Capable of inventing something new.
Well, we've just done it, right? That's what the algorithm is. It's a human artifact, no? Created.
But biological evolution.
But we're biological creatures. And apparently we've used the system of mathematics to, I mean, I don't know if I can answer this question, but we are biological animals. We have come this far to create this new mathematical artifact that is the algorithm. Isn't that the answer? No?
No, it's about innovation because...
it's not an innovation?
If I understood you correctly, you say the human mind is capable of innovation and creativity. That's what I understood, whereas algorithms are not.
I'm sorry, what do you consider an algorithm then, if not a human innovation?
No.
Io non ho capito.
The algorithm itself doesn't make innovations. That's what I understood.
Your question is being...
This would be a discussion.
Okay, just...
It's not a long question, just a short one. I wonder...
Order.
Simply, why do you use for 21st century modern analysis a style from the 14th century? I mean, it was,
I don't understand.
I don't have any objections to the presentation, but it was very difficult to follow it without diagrams and electronic help. Well,
but what diagrams could I produce? It's a humanities.
Yes, but I have a feeling that it would be much more appealing to people and they could understand and follow it better if you systematize it in a few diagrams. It was perfect and I have no objections to it.
No, but I understand. I know. I've been told,
only.
I know, because people who are addicted to diagrams and images need figurative representation, but I'm not.
It's fine. It's fine. Go on. Marcella, it's your time.
You want to leave me for tomorrow, maybe?
No. Tomorrow is another day. Right? So I remember the speaker. I start now.
Yeah, wait.
Independently by the real time.
This one. Yeah. Because there is also farina, right? All right. Am I loud enough? Yeah? Good. So I will try not to talk about everything and to make a frame of something which is quite general. So I excuse myself in advance for maybe I don't succeed on doing so, but I will try. So, physis and techne are often opposed. And here I want to talk specifically about the way we tend to oppose the autonomy of living organisms and its natural growth to the heteronomy of art pieces and artifacts that are artificially fabricated. So this goes hand in hand with your question about innovation. And the way I will try to discuss this divide, which I don't think is very efficacious, is by bringing into light some conciliating efforts on the structural and creative lines of work. I will talk a bit about Valérie, which has been dear to me, and I've done already some work some of you know. But I will bring also Roland Barthes, T.S. Eliot, and of course code biology, since we are here, and I'm very happy to be here. I forgot to thank Almo and the organizers. In this path of trying to conciliating structural and creative lines, Paul Valérie's poetic theory proposes that there is a general morphology to bringing forms into being. Poiesis is not a human only, but an all-living organic function. Works of mind are in continuity with other morphogenic processes in nature. The poetic craft is but a sample of physiology at work. The poetic creation of artifacts follows the same mechanism as hematopoietic production of blood or galactopoietic generation of milk. And here I quote Valérie. He says that. We can agree or not agree. But it's a proposal how to frame this idea that physis and techne are not this far away or divided from each other. So Valérie poetic theory is an attempt. Code biology, in my view, is also an attempt to conciliate creation of artifacts and creation of organic living matter. Code biology proposes a general mechanism. Code poiesis, in this sense, would not be a human only, but an all-living organic function. Works of mind are in continuity with other coded poietic processes in nature. The poietic craft is but a sample of physiology at work. Milk, blood, and poems are ultimately produced by organic codes. Not only by organic codes, but they are based on organic codes. So this said, I also would like to bring into light the theory of narrative in a nutshell. Sorry, Roland Barthes, for doing so, but just sparkles of what I want to bring into light. In many cases, these verbal categories, images, themes, allusions, analogies, metaphors, antitheses, pairs, figures, cadences, whose formal aspect would have been judged until now as poor product, poor closing of thought, actually seem to play a decisive driving role. They are first produced as responses to the demands of such thought situations and then end up by acting as stimulants. The writer is guided by his rhetoric as he guides it. So we are once again with this kind of causality that was mentioned all day long, circular, or where the result interferes in the triggering. So this is important. T.S. Eliot, in his aesthetic theory, says, art is about itself, but this information does not help me to answer my questions, for I do not understand it. The artist does not really know what he's doing. And then, concerning this kind of causation, it might be productive to think about it as autotelic. An autotelic is someone or something that has a purpose in and not apart from itself. Autotelic derives from the Greek blah, blah, blah. But what is interesting is that the Oxford Dictionary cites the word's earliest use in 1932 by T.S. Eliot. So talking about transdisciplinarity and how literature can bring into reality agendas of research, I think this is meaningful. Putting everything I just said together, more than morphogenesis, which is a proposal from Goethe to study from the genesis of biological forms to the genesis of art pieces and scientific knowledge. I think, framed as I just did, it's interesting to talk about physiomorphism. And I will be talking about the morphogenesis of semiotic nets as symbolic systems based on conventional rules to manufacture patterned topological structures that actualize and are actualized by poetic codes. And I will be talking about in particular, about the patterning of nervous and vascular systems in vertebrate, because in my previous life, that is what I was. I was a cell biologist studying the development of vascular and nervous systems. And the creation of sonnets in poetry and arabesques in graphical arts, just to try to outline the basic morphogenetic mechanisms that are in action. Network elements, cell words, punctum, connectivity is constrained by fixed yet arbitrary metric parameters to produce recognizable patterns without losing its unpredictability and creative potential. So not everything is possible, but the possibilities are endless. I think this is the way to go. There is a literary critic, a French woman called Marielle Massé, and when talking about the role played by structure constraints in Baudelaire's poetry, she comes out with the idea of templum. And templum originally means the draw made by the haruspex in the sky, limiting the space where he will read the predictions. So it's a rectangle. It's a limited space. It's a room. It's a cell. About that, Roland Barthes says, it must have been beautiful in the past, the stick pointing towards the sky, that is, towards the unpointable. And furthermore, this gesture is crazy, solemnly drawing a limit from which nothing immediately remains except the intellectual remnants of a cut, consecrating oneself to the totally ritual and totally arbitrary preparation of a meaning. So this is something I've already done with other, in my previous work. I will draw on the possible meanings of one word to instantiate it in biology, art, poetry. So let's take templum. Templum is an epigenetic landscape, for instance. The epigenetic landscape described by Waddington in 1957 I mentioned before represents the process by which the cell, here presented as a ball, faces different possibilities, possible paths during development, leading to different cell fates. And on the right, they're dynamically determined by hidden oppositions of forces. Or templum is the poetic space formulated by Bachelard as walls from literary creation to housework to aesthetic to carpentry take on enhanced and enchanted significances. And just to quote a small piece of poetry in this sense, the cell of myself fills with wonder the whitewashed wall of my secret. So let's take this small compartment to fill it up in different ways with meaning. As graphic arts go, there will be these 3 different moments. I arbitrarily selected works that could illustrate what I'm talking about. There is the leading thread, the arterial tree, and the monocondyle. So I will talk about templum as a trail to formation and the role of limits. And here I shall discuss very briefly growth factors and sonnets or metric rules. Then I will talk about templum as a gateway for transformation. It's not configured properly, but here is written threshold, and I will talk about catalysis and rhyme, and then I will talk about templum as a space for gathering assemblies, and then nerve vases and arabesques and teams, if I have the time. So, templum as a trail to formation. In neurovascular patterning, we have the very important role of secreted factors, and they are common between neurosystem and vascular system. So in this trail of formation, we literally have a mix of factors that patterns it. In the same way, constraints to poetic metrics work. For example, a sonnet is a formal poem with fixed structure. It is 14 lines long, and each line contains 10 syllables, etc., etc., etc. In each of these pairs, the emphasis is on the second syllable, like a heartbeat. To write regular verses is without a doubt to submit oneself to a law which is strange, rather meaningless, always difficult, and sometimes atrocious. Let us, however, try to find matter for rejoicing in this. The exigencies of a strict prosody are the artifice which confers upon a natural language the qualities of resistant matter. This is Paul Valéry. I think it cut somehow but here we are talking about boundary conditions and the structural role of constraints to this kind of form that comes into being. So once again, not anything is possible, but a lot is possible. Then if we go to the gateway for transformation and the role of thresholds, it's completely disconfigured. I don't know why, but okay. Poetry-wise, a threshold is a sacred thing. So self-fate determination proceeds by thresholds. bifurcation lines between two different possible stable states. I won't show because here the scheme is not saying anything because it's not configured. As far as poetic creation is concerned, we have two fragments about the rhymed verses and its crisis. So both Valérie tells us that the album, the Ancient Verses, represents a kind of chronicle in which the older Paul Valéry seeks to recreate the intellectual crisis which led him to reject a 19th century concept of poetry founded on an ethics of symbolist idealism in favor of a poetry which claims autonomy through critical self-reference. And about the same matter, Bachelard in the Poetics of Space tells us the atomism of conceptual language demands reasons for fixation, forces of centralization, but the verse always has a movement. The image flows in the line of the verse, carrying imagination along with it, as through the imagination created a nerve fiber. So we find this resonance between formative acts from cell development to formation of poems as artifacts. And to quote a poem itself, I find myself defining childhood as being the geometrical place of the comings and goings in my father's house. I won't talk about it, but it would be a plus. If I have the time, I come back to it. Last one, if we talk about templum as a space for gathering, for meaningful assemblies, let me talk about how nerves and vases coalesce, and about how verses and themes coalesce in arabesques, for instance. So this illustration from Vesalius shows us the anatomy of circulatory system and nervous systems and humans. And there is a superposition. Much later, in 2005, Camillier published this work on vascular neuronal development, and what he has basically shown is that not only they co-evolve, they co-developed, and they co-function. It's impossible to talk about what determines what. If there are the vases, you pattern the nerves, or the nerves that pattern the vases. They simply are formed in concert. And that's the way for them to be functional. It's topological and meaningful. Pretty much as arabesques. And Valérie has studied arabesques with a great deal of interest. We have three modes of arabesques. We have the ones that are very formal and deal with principles that govern order of forms. We have the ones based on flowing nature of plant forms. And we have calligraphy, which also conveys this marriage between form and meaning. Otherwise, it collapses. It has to. Besides that, we do have intertwingle between each two forms. So here are just a few examples, but the rosette has calligraphy and the basic form, the first kind, the basic the basics of mathematical forms ruling. The second one has calligraphy and an arabesque of vegetable inspiration on the underneath. And also here you have the three together, pretty much as nervous circulation should be constituted together in order to work. And I think I will finish with a quote from Hilke to finish with poetry. I never saw this a strange dwelling again. Indeed, as I see it now, the way it appeared to me, to my child's eye, it's not a building, but is quite dissolved and distributed inside me. Here one room, there another, and here a bit of corridor, which, however, does not connect the two rooms. The stairs that descended with such ceremonious slowness, others narrow cages that mounted in an spiral movement, in the darkness of which we advanced like the blood in our veins. Thank you.
We have time for discussion. We have a quarter of 15 minutes.
I read.
Using the stopwatch, you can be wrong. If the stopwatch is working well.
I've understood that you're highlighting that creativity is enhanced if you have certain boundaries within which you move. And that happens in biological systems as well. There's some, I've been noticing a similar affinity between creativity, artistic creativity, and what software engineers say. They say that with software architecture, you write better code.
That's very interesting. I didn't.
And also, agile programming is about having a software architecture that is flexible itself. That is, with changes at a slower time scale than the code you write, which may have some similarity with what you hinted about when you're speaking of cells expanding and changing boundaries. Yeah.
No. Thank you.
Other questions? And there is a curiosity. Have you never considered the fractal nature of such arabesque or others? It's just a curiosity because
I started
but
reading.
fractal is very intriguing system because it works like a hierarchy of eventually of codes that are self-similar at a different scale, but the mechanism is the same. So maybe an intuition that, or maybe an interesting perspective analyzing the complexity of the system.
I'm sure if we look for fractal patterns, we will find them. But since I'm really interested on the process of building step by step, I think I, at least for the moment, I prefer to stay on the middle, not on the too small and the too big. But I think it's very interesting to do so.
Yeah, I think that the fractal analysis could be used for working with code biology, just to find if there are some connection. I am not sure because we must be mathematicians. We must have a deep knowledge about the mathematical fractals. But they are very interesting because it's very common in the universe how matter is organized.
There are programs that create fractal poems. This exists. I myself, because I'm also a poet and a writer, I tried to do by hand fractal poems, and it's very productive. I mean, it's an organization that the parameters are there, and you just have to.
Because the fractals are created by very simple rules.
Yeah.
And this means universal rules.
And iteration create
complexity and heterogeneity.
And mistake. Nobody wanted to ask.
Sergei Petukhov, who is unfortunately not attend this conference, he did it in many of his papers already. Found these fractal structures and so on. I mean, it's not such a strange idea, and he found it by statistical analysis in the genetic code.
Yeah. Boundary of tumors and in ecology too, but it's very hard interpretation. Yeah, it's very hard interpretation. The pattern are understandable, but the origin why. Yes, please.
Yeah, what's the matter of the fractal structure? There is also another way which is very similar to the fractal. In fact, it can, in some sense, it can contain fractals. It's so-called p-adic numbers. There is one field of the mathematics which is based to the p-adic numbers, p-adic analysis, and so on. Yeah. And the hierarchy can be very well described by this, and I used it to the closeness of the codons to describe codons. Okay, thank you.
Other comments about? Questions? No? Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Seva. So, we conclude this afternoon session at 9 o'clock p.m. This night. We have a concert. I apologize because I have to move at home for family obligation. I'm really sorry. And I see you tomorrow morning. So I'm really sad. Yes. Don't search me, unfortunately, but I have another obligation, very urgent. Some people that know me know why. Thank you very much. Olympia is, of course, Olympia and the Vice President of Accademia. Comunque Marcello, tu puoi fare tutto quello che vuoi in termini di stasera al concerto. Io devo andare a casa.
Beh, sì.
L'ho detto, vero? Mi sembra corretto. No?
Senti, purtroppo.